Hello learners, welcome to this another session of Certificate in Fashion Design program. I Dr. Divyaja welcome you all to this session which is on types of seam. So this is one activity part or the practical manual from the practical workbook part of this particular course, which is course 2, Basics of Pattern Making and Sewing. So today we will be discussing and demonstrating topics, the types of seams, how many types of seams are there and how we can construct particular seams for garment construction. So let's just go back to the previous session. In the previous session, we discussed about the pattern information and marking on the pattern. We explained process of grading of pattern and we defined specification sheet prepared for the pattern. So now we will discuss about the types of seams which is used for the garment construction. So first, just let us discuss what all points and what learning outcome will come after this particular session and discussion. So we learners, you can learn about some of the commonly used seams and understand their application in the garment construction. What are different types of seams are there which you can use according to the fabric for the garment construction. Then you can select suitable seam type for different fabrics, like there are different type of fabrics we use for the garment construction, and every type of fabric have different type of seams for the construction of garment. So you can know, you can select about different type of seams according to the fabric, and you can develop samples of various seam types by which we will be discussing now. So we will discuss that step, how we can create or how we can construct different type of seams. You can follow the right construction technique because every seam we create for garment construction have particular steps and methods of construction. So after going through this discussion and activity which is included in this particular course, you can know about the construction method and techniques, and then you can, after following that particular construction technique, you can just develop the sample by your own. So just let talk about the first thing which you required or the materials you required to for the construction of seam. So first and the most important thing which you will be need about for the construction of seam is the sewing machine. So sewing machine is important. Then we need a good understanding and control of the sewing machine. So this comes after practicing of the sewing machine. So good control on the sewing machine is very important. Then you need a cotton or a muslin fabric for developing a sample. To develop a sample for you, for the beginners, we suggest to use muslin or a cotton cloth or a fabric for developing a sample. Then you should have a good sewing kit in which you need a thread, needle, scissors, measuring tape, marking chalk, etc. for in your sewing kit. Then you need an electric iron to just doing the fabric preparation for ironing the fabric, and you need a pattern paper for if you are going for the construction of seam or garment. You need a pattern paper to develop how to we can develop a pattern or seams. Then first we will talk about discuss what important seam we will be discussing today. So there are various seams, but today we will discuss about lapped seam, French seam and flat fill seam. So these three types of seam we will be discussing today, and we will discuss the steps for the construction of this particular three types of the seam. So first talk about the lapped seam. What lapped seam is and why it is used. So we can say lapped seam is the seam created when one piece of fabric is laid upon another piece of fabric with a overlap. As you can see by the name, it is said as the lapped seam. Lapped means which is something overlapping each other. So the fabric are both right side up and by overlapping the fabric. So this is the basic what lapped seam means. Then we will just now we will discuss the construction method or the step, what is important, how this lapped seam is formed. So now comes the point for which type or why lapped seam, from where lapped seam can be used. So you can use lapped seam like if there is a heavy fabric we are using, like we are using the cambric fabric or the cotswool fabric or some heavy fabric we are using to reduce the bulk from that particular fabric, we use the lapped seam. And it is also used as a design purpose to create a design feature on a particular garment or piece of fabric. We use the lapped seam. So just we will discuss the construction method which is used for creating this particular lapped seam. So just we will just go read out the steps, then we will demonstrate how we create the lapped seam. The first thing what you need or what you have to do is place the first piece of fabric on the flat surface with a cutting guide on that or the tape, measuring tape nearby. So what you have to do if you want to create a lapped seam on a garment or a piece of fabric, what you have to do, you have to keep the fabric on a flat surface and then you have to measure with the measuring guide or the measuring tape. Then line up the raw edges of your one piece of fabric with the straight line on your cutting mat. Then take the second piece of the fabric and lay this upon the first, overlapping by your chosen seam allowance. What this says, that if we have two pieces of fabric, like you can see this, if we have two pieces of fabric, what we are talking about, that you have two pieces, this is the right side, we are talking about the both the pieces from the right side we can take, and we can keep the fabric like this overlapping each other. What we have done, we have taken two pieces of the fabric and we have kept the fabric like this overlapping each other, like one piece above the another piece of the fabric facing the front size of the fabric. Then what we do, when we do the overlapping of this particular piece of fabric on the another, what we do, we just keep the fabric and secure the first piece. Like you can see, we do the first thing, we do stitching over this particular point. Like we can do one sample here. uh, I'm just doing by hand to do explain you. You can do it by sewing machine. So this is what we do. We have kept the fabric up on the another fabric, and then we secure the line with a simple stitch to secure the fabric over the another. Then what we do, we just edge, so what it is said, the secure the lapped seam with your first row of the stitch and then edge stitch your second row of the stitching along the uneven raw edges. So we just do the reverse of that particular fabric and do the stitching from the back side. So as you can see in the picture, what we have done, we have two pieces of fabric, we keep it like this overlapping each other, then we secure one line or a plain stitch. Then what we do, we have the another side with the open edge. Then from the open edge, which is open at the back side, we do one stitch. So this is how you can see in this sample, that this is the how flat fill seam, this is lapped seam, how it is created. This is when we create one particular stitch one from one edge, and then we create or do stitching at the back side to create another stitch. So this is how lapped seam it is made. Then we go for the French seam. So this was lapped seam and it is used for the bulk, to reduce the bulk from the fabric. Then we create the French seam. So French seam, how it is created and what it is for. This is a strong and narrow seam. It is a self knitted seam ideal for sheer fabrics where the seam shows through the fabric onto the right side of the garment. What it says, it is said that it is a self knitted seam. When you see a French seam on a particular garment, when we do, it is done for neatening of the fabric. It is very neat from every side. If and it is generally used for the sheer fabric. Sheer means we use for the transparent fabrics, like we use for the georgette, chiffon, or the net fabric, which is used from in which the seam is visible from the outside, and it gives a soft edge to the seam, and the edge of the garment is very soft and knitted. So you can use the French seam. It is done on the lightweight to the medium weight fabric. It is done suitable for thick, heavy fabric as it adds a lot of bulk. So it is not suitable for the thick and heavy fabric. It is not, we cannot use the French seam on the denim fabric or any bulky fabric. So this French seam is not suitable for the thick heavy fabric, and it adds a lot of bulk to that particular fabric. So as discussed, use the French seam for the sheer fabrics. Then comes the method of construction for the French seam. In this also we keep the fabric with the wrong side facing each other on right side out, like you can see in the picture. Generally for the stitching, when we go, we start stitching from the wrong side of the fabric, but when we are creating a French seam, we create the fabric, or we use the start the stitching from the right side of the fabric. What we do, we have two pieces of the fabric. Suppose this is the right part of the fabric and this is the wrong, so we keep the fabric together from the wrong part together, like where you can see in the picture also. We keep the fabric like this, and this is, both these are the right side of the fabric. Then after joining this particular piece of the fabric, what we do, we just do a simple running stitch from one edge, like one edge of the fabric, and we leave a allowance of around 0.5 inches or 1 centimeter allowance we give, and we do one simple running stitch. When we do simple running stitch, like you can see, we do a simple running stitch on the fabric, simple stitch on the fabric with your machine you do, and then what, from the right side, not from the wrong side, and this is how it looks. This is how we get the fabric. And what we do, what the extra margin or extra ease what we have taken during stitching the samples, or stitching of the joining of the fabric, we cut this extra allowance or extra margin what we have given. So after cutting the extra margin, we get the fabric, or get the pieces like this. So this is the right side of the fabric. So when we cut the edge of the fabric or the margin what we have taken, we just turn around or just do open the fabric like this. We fabric like this. Then you can see in the picture and understand. we just open the fabric and do ironing from both front and back side, from front side and back side, to flatten the fabric. Once the fabric is flattened, what we do, we turn the fabric from back side. What we have now, we have the back portion like this. So when you see the back portion or the back wrong side of the fabric, we get a neated or a neat or a clean back portion. And when you see a garment with a French seam, or a, like if you are using a preparing a garment with a net fabric or a chiffon fabric, and you do stitching from the wrong side, you will your side part of the garment or the side seam will not look neat. So if you use the French seam, as you can see in the picture, from the creating from the starting from the right side, you get the side part, side seam very neated, which looks very good when you construct a garment. So in this process, the French seam is created. You can see a sample of a French seam. What we see, this is how it is created. This is the right side of the pattern or the piece of the fabric. This is joined together, then ironed, and then this is how we get the French seam to final part of that particular seam. This is used, you can make it very easily, and it is very easy for the sheer fabrics and the transparent fabrics we use. Then the third seam which we are discussing today is the flat fill seam. So flat fill seam, you have seen, you people usually we see in our daily life, but we don't know the name of that particular seam and what how it is made. So let us talk about the flat fill seam. So this is very strong and sturdy seam that is used in the garment that will take a lot of wear. The raw edges are encased and made flat. It has a flat and attractive appearance since it has twin or double needle effect on down its length. Like when you see this particular seam, it seems like it is made with a machine which has double needle or twin needle, but it is not like that, and it is created differently. So it is used on we see on our jeans what we wear every day. We see on the side of that particular on the our jeans, we see the side seam of that jeans, it is made with or it is prepared with the flat fill seam. So let us talk about the construction method of the flat fill seam. So in this also you need two pieces of the fabric to construct the flat fill seam, keeping the wrong side of the fabric to each other, then right side out, stitch the plain seam. Like what we have done in the French seam, we do the same thing. What then we have taken the two piece of the fabric, the wrong side together, and this is the right side of the fabric what we are going to stitch. So we have secured the two piece of the fabric with a plain seam. We have just done a running stitch on the two pieces of the fabric. Then what we do, we cut one seam allowance and fold the edge of the bigger seam allowance over the smaller seam allowance. So what we do, we have secured two piece of the fabric facing wrong side. We cut one seam allowance. Seam allowance means the margin which we have given on the fabric. Like this is the seam plain stitch or the seam we have done, and the gap between the cutting line and the stitching line is the seam allowance or the margin what we have given. So what we do, we cut the seam allowance of one fabric of one piece and fold the edge of the bigger seam allowance over the smaller seam allowance. of the and press. Like if we have two fabrics, what we are talking about, and we have the two seam allowance we have. This is the two seam allowance we have. So what we do, we just cut the one piece, one seam allowance what we have, we just cut or fold on over the bigger seam allowance what we have. Then from the right side of the fabric, press the seam and stitch on the edge of fold. Thus there are two stitching line on the right side and one on the wrong side. Like you can see in the picture that we have the two fabric, we join or we have secured it with a plain seam with giving some margin on the fabric. Then what we do, we just flatten we just do the we flatten the fabric together like this, and then we cut one seam allowance, we just fold on above the another. Then what we do, we fold like this and we do stitching on this particular point of particular edge. So when we do stitching on the particular different edge, we get two stitching lines. This is how we do. We just make one stitch plain seam or stitch on one edge, then we just fold the seam allowance on over the on a bigger seam allowance, and then what we do, we just create one another seam line on the another edge. So this is how we get the flat fill seam, which when you see on the fabric or the garment, it seems like that it is stitched with a double needle sewing machine, but it is prepared like this. So you can see this is the final sample how it looks like. So this is from the back side, you can see it is folded on the another side of the edge, and then it is stitched on the folded part, and we get the sample done like this. So following this construction method, you can prepare the sample, and it is very easy. So you can just practice this with your just take two pieces of the fabric and you can just start following the construction method. You can see the pictures from this, and you can follow and prepare a sample of your own. So this was about the flat fill seam which we see on our jeans or the pant we use. Then there are some other seam types which are used for the garment construction. Is first is the decorative seam. So apart from this construction or seams which is used to develop a garment, we have some decorative seams also. So first is the decorative seam. These seams serve both the functional and the decorative purpose. It is used for the construction of the garment also and for the decorative purpose. So these are visible on the right side of the garment in the form of top stitch to emphasize design details. These seams are quite often done with the contrasting colored threads. So these stitches we will discuss in another next session what we will having, and these seams are basically related to the different decorative stitches we use, and it is done with the uh, generally done with the contrast color. So what seams we have discussed earlier, it is done with the same color of the fabric or the color which is very relevant to that particular fabric. So decorative seams are for the functional also and for the decorative also, and it is generally done with the contrasting color of threads. Then we do the top stitched seam. This is a type of plain seam. Plain seam may be when we do a single stitch or a plain stitch seam on the fabric and we do an over stitching on that particular seam, it is said as the top stitching. The raw edges should be knitted before top stitching. And there are two types of top stitchings we have single top stitching, we have double top stitching. Then one type of seam is the weld seam. So weld seam is a decorative seam which is sometimes done with a contrast color thread. It is a seam on we see on our trousers, jeans, as we discussed. It is similar to the flat fill seam we use. So it is seen on the trousers, jeans, jumpsuit, kids wear usually, and like that types of garment. And as it is flat seam, it specially done on the heavyweight fabric. So weld seam is also done on the heavyweight fabric. So this is, you can see, it is also similar to the flat fill seam what we have discussed just now. It is similar to that fabric, but just difference is that this particular seam we do with a different colored thread, like not with the similar color of thread which is similar to the fabric, but we do with the contrast color thread on the garment to give it a decorative seam or a for the decorative purpose. So this is how different type of seams are used on the garment constructions. So this was basic information what we discussed. Now there are more what we will be discussing in the next sessions. So just now we discussed about different seam types according to the fabric. As we have discussed, every fabric is for different fabric we use different type of seams, because we, as we discussed, we use the lapped seam for the lightweight fabric. For the fabric in which we don't want to create bulk, we use French seam. For the lightweight or the sheer fabrics, we have use the French seam. And we use the flat fill seam for the fabrics which are more to be weared, like denim and the jeans what we use in our daily wear. So we discussed about different seam types according to the fabric type, and we demonstrated methods of construction of lapped seam, French seam, and flat fill seam. Hope you get some knowledge from this session, and we will discuss more in the next session. Thank you.